Hi, and welcome to a regular guy's guide to changing your brake pads on a 2006 Ford Freestyle. Quick legal stuff. I'm a regular guy. This video is meant to show the general principles of brake servicing and not to be a comprehensive instruction. Also, use common sense, safety at all times, and refer to instruction manuals when you have a question. Alright, here's our Ford Freestyle wheel. Let's get started. Let's look at some tools you'll need. So you're going to need a jack and a tie iron. This jack is just the one that comes with the car for changing the spare. You're going to need a C-clamp and a block of wood. A C-clamp should have a throat that's good 6, 7, 8 inches long. A screwdriver, some wrenches and ratchets. I'm going to use ratchets. You could use wrenches too. And you're going to need a 13 millimeter, 15 millimeter, 3/4 inch sockets, and a Torx 40. Some paper towels for cleanup, a hammer for some motivation, a bungee cord or a wire or rope maybe, a simple solvent. I'm going to use alcohol here, a cheap plastic bowl, some brake lubricant, and your new brake pads. Let's start properly with the car in park, the emergency brake on, and we're going to block the wheels. I like to block the wheels opposite the wheel I'm working on, so this is the back right wheel. I'm just using some theatrical stand bags here because they're available to me. And here's our wheel. It needs to come off, of course. You could use a tire iron, but I'm going to use a breaker bar. I much prefer it. The leverage you get. This is a 3/4 inch socket. And while the tire is still on the ground, before you jack it up, you want to crack all the lug nuts loose. Grab your jack. Again, this is just a jack that comes with the car. Most cars have a point where it's best to raise it, and the guides underneath here show you where. Jack goes in and up you go. If you've got a fancy jack, like hydraulic or something, it's best to use that, but this jack will be sufficient for the project. Here's our tire iron again. I find this process a little tedious, so I'm going to switch to the socket instead. Just a quick reminder, make sure the car is on level ground and that you're being safe, blocking the wheels and locking the transmission and so on. So now spin off your lug nuts. If they're still a little tight, you may have to apply the tire iron a little bit, but they should spin off pretty easily. And that plastic ball, here's what it's for. Basically, so I don't lose the lug nuts, I don't roll away, and I'm not missing one when I go to put it back on. Pull off the wheel to expose the brake assembly. You basically got two things here. You've got the rotor that rotates and the brake caliper assembly where the pads are. This rotor has some scoring on it, so we're going to remove it later and have it cut. Alright, the next thing to do is to bottom the caliper piston. Take your C-clamp and straddle the caliper, and you're going to screw it down, pushing the piston back in. Let's take a look at that C-clamp one more time. Watch the top of it and where it's going. You don't kink or catch that line. Make sure it's on the solid part of the caliper. Screw the C-clamp down, pushing the piston back in. There's your fluid tank. Watch it doesn't overflow. It usually doesn't. This can take a little bit of force, but you'll just have to sense when you're at the bottom roughly. Remove your clamp and you'll have a nice gap there that will allow you to slide it back and forth and remove the caliper and the pads. I want to point out this brake line. This feeds your caliper with brake fluid. It's pretty sturdy, but you don't want to kink it or break it. Always be aware of it. Next thing to do is we're going to remove the first caliper bolt. Grab your 13 millimeter socket or open end wrench and you're going to remove the top caliper bolt. You just need to loosen it up here. This is actually harder than it looks. I pre-loosened this for the video. There are two of these bolts, and here's the lower one. You're going to loosen that as well. I did not pre-loosen this, so this is what the hammer is for. Most regular guys do not have an impact wrench, and this is my solution. One tip here is to keep pressure on the wrench so it doesn't bounce as much. It's a crude but effective technique for loosening bolts. One thing to note here is other makes of cars often use a recessed Allen head for their caliper bolts. Go ahead and spin those bolts out, and you can throw them in the bowl with your lug nuts so you don't lose them. Different makes of cars use different ways of doing it. These are just short little bolts. Others are long and are part of the caliper slide. The slides on this brake is integrated and has a rubber boot where you can't get to it. Next, have your bungee cord or your wire available. You're going to pull the caliper off. It'll be pretty loose at this point, and you can just pull it off. And there is our spent pads. We're going to get rid of those in a minute. And I'm going to take the bungee cord. This is why they have hooks on them. That's why I like to use them. And you're going to just run it around the strut there and you're going to hook it onto your brake so it's nice and safe. Again, that you'll see that hose gives you plenty of slack to work with, but you do have to hang the brake up and make sure it's secure. You don't want it to fall off, and it'll hang quite nicely down there. And here's the this is an old shim stuck to the pistons, and we'll just peel that off. Those are the pistons that we bottomed out. You'll see they're pretty far back, but not far enough. We'll deal with that in a minute. You got to remove these pads, and your screwdriver can come in handy here. Here I just stick the screwdriver in, just kind of very gently wedge them top and bottom out, and eventually they'll just get loose and you can pop them right out. I got my money's worth on this pad. Boy, it's thin and desperately needing replacement. There's nothing left on that pad. Pop the other one out, and you'll be on to removing the caliper bracket. Some calipers do not have a bracket, like it's still on there. Others, when you remove the two bolts and you pull the caliper off, the whole caliper is off and the rotor is exposed and able to be removed. But this car has a bracket, and this has to come off too. Since if we were just replacing the pads, we could skip this next process. But this rotor needs to come off to be cut, so we have to remove this bracket. It also has two bolts. Here's a 15mm socket, and you're going to remove the two bolts that hold this bracket on. These are pretty stiff bolts, and you can see I'm using two hands here. That's for a reason. They are on the long side, and they're pretty hard to remove. It took quite a bit of force to break them loose. You don't need to pull these bolts all the way out. They go through three things, the last of which is the bracket. And once they're clear of the bracket, you can leave the bolts sitting there, as you can just see there, and pull the bracket off. Take a quick look, make sure everything is okay, and then you can set it aside. It's time to remove the rotor. The rotor has a small Torx bolt that has to be removed. These are installed at the factory to hold the rotor on while the manufacturing process happens. The tires and lug nuts are what really hold your rotor on. Here I'm using a ratchet with a Torx 40 socket. I picked this up for just a few bucks at the auto parts store, and you're going to need it to remove that little bolt. And now your rotor should be loose. Sometimes the rotor will require a little tap with a hammer and a block of wood, but it should just slide off. This has a little scoring on it. Don't worry about the rust, that just happens because it gets wet. But the scoring does matter, and we're going to go have it cut. So we're off to the auto parts store to find out what that's all about. I've found that the small auto parts businesses usually offer this service rather than the large chains. They're going to put your rotor on a machine like this, which is going to run a cutter across it and make a nice flat surface, which is what you want for braking. This costs about $10, and it's definitely worth it. Much cheaper than new rotors. They do have their limits though. You can only cut them so far. And here's our finished rotor. It looks really nice now. No scoring, nice and flat. The store near me puts a non-directional finish on at the end, which is a nice touch. Stamped on the rotor is the limit to what it can be cut. In their last cut they conveniently marked 27.2, so I have a little to go. Rotors have their limits, and once you cut them so far you have to replace them. So putting it back together is pretty much the reverse of what you did to take them apart. Slide the rotor back on and into place. You'll notice I'm not going to put that Torx bolt back in. And that is unfortunately where we have to stop. Due to time length restrictions with YouTube, I had to break this video into two sections. I decided I did not want to restrict the content. I wanted to have enough time to show you everything. So please tune in to part 2 of this at this link.